Welcome back to Avoidant Recovery episode 3, the dating trifecta of trauma. If you haven't caught episode 2 yet, I would strongly encourage you to circle back and listen to that first, as it provides a lot of detail and context for where we're picking up from today. So episode 2 looked at 2 of the 3 factors that make up the trifecta and their intersection and relationship. So this was the fast-paced intimacy of female same-sex relationships and insecure attachment styles, especially avoidant attachments. Now, the dating trifecta of trauma is where we blend in adult female ADHD, because it creates this little pressure cooker of emotional dysregulation if we're not careful. Now, before we get into this episode, whilst I have been working in healthcare for nearly 20 years and I'm not unfamiliar with chronic and complex cases, the work I currently do deals with mostly physical ailments. Whilst psychobehavioral elements are a factor, they're not the focus. But as psychology and mental health is an area that I am immensely interested in, I have decided to head back and undertake even more study, specifically in the area of mental health. So whilst I am undertaking accredited training in counselling and mental health, I very much need to reiterate that I am not a mental health professional yet, and irrespective of this, the information I share on this platform is not mental health advice. It is purely creating a space for you to hopefully feel safe, seen, validated, and supported in your healing journey, whatever that may look like for you. Now, I just need to throw in that after about 10 minutes, the audio within this podcast is going to change slightly. I don't know why. I'm using the same microphone, same settings, but for some reason the volume points change. So if you do notice a little bit of a change in volume or tone that you may be hearing, I have tried to edit it in post, but there may be a slight shift. And that's just me, again, hyper-focusing on things that are likely not relevant, and now that I've pointed out, you probably won't be able to unhear it. So, the dating trifecta of trauma. This episode, we're talking about the intersection of all 3 of these emotional forces colliding and how it may manifest in a relationship. Insecure attachment styles with a focus on avoidant attachment, the fast-tracked female same-sex emotional intimacy, and adult female ADHD. Now, I call it the trifecta of trauma because when all 3 show up to the party, the relationship can feel like it gives you the highest of highs, but it can also crash you to the lowest of lows that you've ever experienced. Now, irrespective of what may be at play within a trifecta for you, you might have one element, you might have all 3. None of this is about any form of blame. It is simply about trying to provide some insights and clarity. It's about helping try to foster some introspection, some reflection, and some understanding of what may have happened or what may be happening or unfolding in your life at the minute, so you can hopefully stop reliving it. So at the very least, if it provides you with even just feeling seen or validated, that's fantastic. That's what I want. But if it also provides maybe some inspirational insights to potentially pursue different avenues where you may be looking to improve your mental and emotional health, that's even better. Love this. Now, where my life and lived experience comes into play here is I have spent near 20 years unpacking and overcoming a heavily dismissive, leaning, fearful attachment style. So thankfully, I am sitting vastly more secure. And I also have been diagnosed with ADHD, the inattentive type, and I am also a lesbian. So we have the intersection of all 3 of the dating trifecta of trauma. So I have been a perpetuator of some of the toxic behaviours that we'll be discussing, but I have also been on the receiving end of it whilst being a somewhat securely attached partner. So I've been on both sides of the equation. I have undertaken some of my own self-guided study in this. It is things that I have tackled within the studies I'm undertaking, and I've discussed this at length with multiple mental health professionals. So again, it's not mental health advice, but it is somewhat evidence informed. It is very much life informed and experience informed, and hopefully it helps you feel seen, safe, and heard. Now, because we covered the intersection of female same-sex relationships and insecure attachment styles in episode 2, we're going to pick up and throw in the 3rd element of the trifecta. So let's start with the part that often gets missed in this trifecta, and that is ADHD, especially in adult women. So most people associate ADHD with hyperactive boys bouncing off the walls, but ADHD in women often looks nothing like that. It's quieter, it's often more internalized, and it's very misunderstood. And in relationships, it can be incredibly messy, intense, and often mistaken for being too much. So I want to break down a little bit of what it feels like. And I just want to say that even if you have been working with various mental health professionals, psychologists, and so on, it is still phenomenally misunderstood in adult women. And a perfect example that I can throw at this was a few years ago, I was working with a phenomenally trauma-informed psychologist who was helping me overcome some other areas of trauma in my life that were heavily related to the avoidant attachment style that I had. Now, within this time that I was seeing him, I was also undergoing the diagnostic process for figuring out that I did have inattentive ADHD. And his response was so incredibly invalidating and highlighted how much he was not informed in this space. And that is something that's very important to remember, because not every health professional, even though they may be a psychologist, they may be a, say, physiotherapist, whatever it is, people have their areas of expertise. Just because you have a title, it doesn't mean you are the master of every element that falls within that vocation. Now, his response to me advising him of my diagnosis was, "Oh, I don't agree with that," despite the fact that it wasn't anything that I ever spoke to him about, because I was aware that that wasn't his area of specialty. His area of specialty was interpersonal relationships and trauma. And whilst ADHD does come into play with some of those elements, it wasn't his area of specialty. So I pursued going through the diagnostic process with people who I knew it was their specialty. And his response very much highlighted exactly what I thought. It wasn't his wheelhouse, because his response was, "Oh, well, you're not fidgety, you're not bouncing off the walls." He was typecasting me like the 8-year-old hyperactive boy that most people associate ADHD with. Now, there is a plethora of evidence and literature that identifies how different ADHD manifests in boys versus girls, or men versus women. So it was just so invalidating that he just, without having any understanding of my experience, we'd never explored it, he just brushed it off and thought that just because he's got a couple of degrees and a shitload of letters after his name, he decided that he was the authority on my diagnosis of ADHD. Fuck you, buddy. That's not the case. There are other people that have even more letters after their name that have been working in that area for almost as long as I've been alive. They were the ones that arrived at the diagnosis, and that is their area of specialty. So no offense, I'm going to go with them. And thankfully I did, because what they have been able to do with me in that area has been absolutely life-changing. So that's one point I do actually want to highlight. Every health professional within a profession has their own area of interest, areas of expertise, and specific skill sets. Just because someone has a title of a certain profession does not mean that they are an expert across the board within their entire profession. That's why specialties exist. General practitioners are generalists. Then you have specialists in surgery. You've got orthopedics, you've got vascular, you've got neuro, you've got ENT. Within physiotherapy, you've got pregnancy, female health, pelvic floor physios, musculoskeletal. Podiatry, you've got musculoskeletal, you've got general, you've got aged care, you've got high risk. Occupational therapy, you've got upper limb, lower limb. Every profession has its specialty. So if you find that you are working with someone and they seem to be very competent and skilled in one area, but then you raise another problem or something else and they're not as skilled, there are other people that exist out there, and it is 100% within your right, and you have your agency over your health. If you find that there is a health professional, regardless of if it's for mental health or physical health, that doesn't seem to have the skill set required, you are 100% within your right to seek second opinions or third opinions. They don't own you, and they do not know your body better than you do. Whilst they can provide objective information and the outside looking in, and they do have a higher degree of skill in whatever area, well, hopefully a high level of skill in whatever area that they work in, to provide you with some guidance and answers. Now, this isn't to encourage any form of doctor shopping to play into confirmation bias. It's just encouraging you that if you find that there is a new condition, complaint, realm of your body or brain that you want to work on, and the current health team that you have doesn't seem to either resonate with you or they don't seem to have the skill set, you have the agency to actually make choices to seek further information elsewhere. They don't own you. And that finishes that side quest. So tell me you've got ADHD without telling me you've got ADHD. So let's break down what adult female ADHD may look and feel like for you. And it does vary very much from person to person. It is a spectrum. We all have varying degrees of elements that come into play for each person. So we're just going to talk about some of the big hitters in this space. Some of you may experience all of this. Some of you may experience only one or two pieces of the puzzle. Similar with me. There's some elements that are bigger drivers or manifest themselves more profoundly in my experience. So one of the biggest things with inattentive ADHD, chronic inattentiveness. So physically, we are there, but our brain can often be somewhere else, or our brain is trying to be there, but there may be 3,000 other things or thoughts happening within our mind at the same time. Now, some people, this is where there's a very big difference between the manifestation of ADHD and people. Some people, myself included, highly empathetic and very good at picking up on emotional cues. However, some other people, they might be awful at picking up emotional cues, so they can miss things, and that can also derail some of the relationships and connections that you have. But irrespective of reading someone's emotional cues, if we have this inattentive element at play, oftentimes we can zone out in conversations and we may forget very significant details that our partner, our colleagues, anyone that we've been speaking to, we can forget important details that someone has told us minutes, hours, or days ago. And it's not because we don't care, it is literally because our executive function is overloaded. And how it will often feel if we're called out for this, it can be highly embarrassing, phenomenally shame-inducing, and essentially it just ends up feeling like we're constantly disappointing people that we care about. And I have had experiences where the one ex-partner in particular would get disproportionately angry and go into a barrage of just belittling me for forgetting benign details like one of their 40 different co-workers with whatever bullshit drama was going on at the time in their workplace. So it is real, and it is something that it spirals us into shame, or it can spiral us into shame very easily, especially if we are in relationships or have people around us that aren't aware of it, or they are just not recognizing this. And even on that element, you can see how with the intersection of a few of the other elements within this trifecta, so if there is trauma that comes into play and there's insecure attachment styles, and you are someone with a history of trauma, oftentimes you can end up in relationships where it is almost normal for you to have someone that is belittling you, that is shaming you, because that may have been the environment that you're growing up in. So it can become this sort of self-perpetuating mechanism that just keeps feeding the beast of shame. On that note, ADHD forgetfulness, it's not cute, it's fucking awful. We forget dates, we forget birthdays, we forget to follow through on important tasks or things that we've promised people that we would do. It can be in our relationships, can be in a work setting, and we just sit on the sideline watching the trust people have in us be eroded, and it's nothing that we are doing intentionally. So internally we can feel panicked, we feel shame, we're apologetic and terrified that people think that we're careless. So we overcompensate, and this is why emotionally and mentally we can be so chronically exhausted, because we are working at 300% just to try and function like a neurovanilla person. And this is that masking that people talk about so commonly. So no wonder people with ADHD, especially adult females, feel high levels of burnout, emotional distress, are constantly exhausted, because we're trying to get our non-typical neurobrain to function typically, and the amount of work that is required to do that is phenomenal and it is so exhausting. So it's important to recognize that firstly, you are not alone if you're experiencing this, and you shouldn't be ashamed of it because we are literally built differently. Now that's where I want to highlight the masking, the perfectionism and the people pleasing that often comes as a result. So masking is again where the neurospicy people, myself included, we are trying to act neurovanilla, function in a neurotypical world. So this is essentially what masking is. And because of this overcompensation that we're engaging in, we will often strive for perfectionism. But the double-edged sword for that is we can be overwhelmed with the perfectionism we're trying to achieve, and it can just lead to procrastination because the thought of just trying to function is exhausting. So many women with ADHD learned very young to perform stability. We very much tried to just seem normal. So this often leads to people-pleasing behaviors. We can become agreeable. We can try and impress those around us. And masking, like I said, it takes energy. And when you finally get close to someone, sometimes the mask will often slip, and then they can sometimes see the chaos behind it, which can trigger some of these shame spirals. This somewhat leads into the double-edged sword element that I love, but I also hate about ADHD as well. But I think I still love it. I'm learning to love it. And that is our emotional intensity. So with ADHD, if we are not leaning into dysregulation and detachment, if the avoidant attachment is coming into play, so if we're not triggered, when things are not triggering us and we're just settling into ADHD land, emotional intensity is something that comes into play. We can feel phenomenal levels of joy and love, but there's a double edge to this sword. The other side of the coin is we can also feel exceedingly high levels of fear and rejection. So rejection sensitivity is a huge thing. So there's not actually any medium or tapered setting for this, or tepid setting. We're very high, very low. So our emotional reactions aren't exaggerated, but they are dysregulated. And remember, dysregulation is also something that happens so often when we have an insecure attachment style at play. So with ADHD just on its own, we can spiral very fast and melt down over something exceedingly small, which, yes, guilty. And this is often because our nervous system is already redlining. So when this feeds into relationships, sometimes we can be told that we're too sensitive, we're too much, or too dramatic. And sometimes you may have been told quite frequently to calm down or stop overthinking, or you just have to let something go. When in reality, when neurodivergent, we can be looping and we can be emotionally overloaded. So the calm down element and the meltdowns aren't so much an element that I've experienced, but goddamn, the overthinking and the thought ruminating, yep, that very much is in play. That is something that medication helped me with a lot, but also a shitload of therapy. And now we land at one of the biggest elements that come into play, and that is the hyperfocus. This is a big one. Now, if you think back to episode 2, and we talk about female same-sex relationships and the fast-paced emotional intimacy that can build very early on, couple this with an insecure attachment style, irrespective of if it's an anxious attacher or if it's more of that fearful avoidant attacher, and it doesn't really matter how much they're leaning dismissive or not, but the love bombing. So if we've got love bombing coupled with a hyperfocus, it means that you can lock onto a person and they become your emotional universe. Then couple this with some of the other emotional elements that I've discussed with ADHD. You're excited, you can become almost obsessed. It's all consuming with this relationship. But then we have potentially some of this overthinking element. So we overanalyze texts, we replay conversations all the time. And then this is where the future faking element that comes in with the avoidant attachment comes into play as well. The daydreaming about the future can happen almost immediately. Layer that in with the intimacy and the fast-paced milestones that can often occur in female same-sex relationships. So it's a very vicious cycle that can develop. And why it happens from the ADHD side of things is ADHD brains crave dopamine, because that is one of the neurochemical elements, or the primary neurochemical element that feeds what's happening in these neurospicy individuals, myself included. So if we think about this, it's new love. So it's a dopamine tsunami. This person becomes your nervous system's entire reward system, but it is not grounded in reality. It is often fueled by that neurochemical reward-seeking, fantasy-driven novelty behaviors. And so when the stimulation drops, so does the dopamine, and now you're left chasing that closeness just to feel stable again. So by now, from episode 2 and what we've literally just discussed in this last 20 minutes, you can start to see how this can become a phenomenal trifecta of trauma, because each element exacerbates the other elements. So it can just create this overtly intense experience that also has the overtly intense obliteration of the connection when it inevitably dissolves. So irrespective of where you're sitting and what your trifecta might comprise of, and typically this is a very broad generalization, but oftentimes in a dating relationship, both people will have some element of the trifecta present. It's like attracts like, and trauma attracts trauma, really. So it can vary from person to person, and again, it's a broad generalization. But irrespective of what's going on, if you are the ADHDer that's initiating the breakup, or you're the ADHDer that's on the receiving end of the breakup, couple in the female same-sex relationship dynamic and the insecure attachment, when these relationships end, they oftentimes don't just hurt, they can derail and deregulate you to absolute hell. So you're often not just heartbroken, you're chemically unanchored and, like I said, very dysregulated. Thought loops can intensify, you can ruminate, you panic, you have anxiety, you can't sleep. And this isn't weakness, it is a neurobiological crash of your nervous system. Because if we think about what ADHD brains struggle with, it's switching tasks, it's emotional regulation, it's interruption of routine, even though, yes, we can seem highly disorganized. So when that routine, especially if it's involved another person, it can obliterate our nervous system when the relationship ends. And if you're surrounded by people who aren't informed or understanding of the dynamics of female same-sex relationships, if they're not understanding or aware of what attachment theory is, what insecure attachments, anxious, avoidance, and so on, how that manifests into relationships, how trauma is layered into it, how that affects you neurologically and emotionally, if they're not aware of ADHD and how it manifests and what it does to us at a neurobiological level, if they're not aware of that, and this is where we can be left feeling so invalidated, because you can often be on the receiving end of really dismissive, invalidating statements like, I don't understand why you're so upset about this. You should just get over it. They weren't good for you anyway. You just need to move on. And if you especially have the thought loops and the rumination that's happening with ADHD, which for me personally, I suffered a lot more of when I wasn't medicated, if people don't have that understanding of it, it can leave you feeling so unseen, unheard, and invalidated. And I just want you to know that it's not you. There is nothing wrong with you. It is, your emotions are real and it's your lived experience. So please, if someone is invalidating you, it doesn't mean that your experience and the emotions that you are feeling are not valid. They're valid, they're real, they're yours. And I'm just sorry if you have people around you like that. But there are other communities that exist. There are so many people out there that will hear you, they will see you, and they will validate you. Now, I'm just going to loop things back to episode 2 a little bit more, just so you can really see how these interrelationships exist. So if we have a look at the fast-tracked intensity of female same-sex relationships, in episode 2, we spoke a little bit about like the U-Haul dynamic, but let's look at how it plays into ADHD and attachment trauma. So in queer female relationships, intimacy often accelerates quickly. We're often emotionally bonding, even within days. And what can happen in some instances, and thankfully I'm a lot more aware of this over the last few years after a lot of therapy and self-awareness. You can pull yourself up on this if you have that awareness, but what can happen if it goes unchecked is you can imagine a shared life with this person within weeks. And for a lot of people, all of this experience, it can feel like recognition. It feels like you're coming home. So for someone with ADHD and attachment trauma, this kind of connection can feel magical almost. And this is often because the person or both people are feeling stimulated and emotionally seen. Sometimes they're feeling like they are no longer made to feel like they're too much, at least not yet. And they can finally stop masking and feel accepted. But here's the problem. If emotional safety hasn't been built and it's built on intensity and fantasy, that's what the foundation is. So it is built on an exceptionally unstable foundation. And what starts as connection quickly becomes enmeshment, and that is not healthy. Which means the time bomb has started ticking. Now, how does this tie into insecure attachment styles? So oftentimes anxiously attached people will cling to the closeness because they may be terrified of losing it. Avoidance might mirror your intensity until it gets too real. And ADHD only intensifies all of it, making it difficult to regulate the pace, the bonding, and the emotional dependency. So what many may mistake for falling in love is often a collision of mutual wounds. It's not fate, it's trauma recognition, and it can feel deceptively right. And now we're just going to layer in part 3 of this trauma shitcake, avoidant attachment, the push, pull, and then the panic. Now, avoidant attachers, especially our fearful avoidants, they'll often come out of the gate pretty hard, pretty fast. They'll often start out curious, very attentive, very good at acts of service and gift giving, and they can seem phenomenally emotionally present and engaged. And they'll often say all of the right things that we really want to hear. I've never felt this way before. You make me feel safe. I never knew I could love anyone like this. I never knew that anyone could love me like this. I really want something real, and it finally feels like I have that with you. But what they often mean is, this feels really good. It's really validating for me and my shame wounds, and just it's making me feel amazing. I'm getting big dopamine hits, as long as this doesn't require me to stay emotionally exposed or become emotionally exposed or get deeper with the connection. So what happens when things deepen? They retreat. So they may do the slow fade, so they stop texting back or wanting to spend time with you at the same frequency as you were previously. They might ghost you. They might go quiet when conversations get emotionally deep or complex. They might shut down in response to this. God, that's my ex to a T. And then if they do the abrupt breakup or discard, as some people call it, which I feel in some cases rightly so, because that's exactly what it fucking feels like. So if the discard happens, they'll often say, I don't know how I feel anymore. I just lost feelings. You deserve someone better. I can't give you what you need. The spark's just gone, even though 6 hours prior, they may have been telling you that you were the love of their life. You were planning a future together, and they just pull the rug out from under you because everything is too much for them right now. They're shut down, they're dysregulated. But what will often happen is they project and they start blaming your needs for their discomfort. And so you become the problem. And when they are in this state, there is nothing you can do. You just need to go and find people to support you and lick your wounds, because you are not going to get any comfort from them. Because we need to remember that with avoidant attachers, and I have experienced this, and thank God I've done a truckload of therapy to try and get me out of this, the triggers are still there, but I am aware of the triggers and I don't act on the triggers. But essentially, if you have a history of trauma and you have an insecure attachment style that is often a fearful or a dismissive avoidant, emotional activation equals danger. So for avoidance, emotional intimacy often triggers this threat response. So they'll often interpret closeness as engulfment. So even if they wanted the relationship, even if they loved you to death, they can't regulate the fear that it triggers. And so when ADHD and avoidant attachment coexist, some avoidant partners, my ex included, have ADHD as well. So they may love bomb during a hyperfocus. They can be hot and cold, intensely affectionate, and then suddenly very unavailable. They may blame overstimulation on their shutdowns or life overwhelm, but yes, they may have some of that going on as well because of the neurocognitive elements of ADHD, but they may have that emotional dysregulation that's being fed from their avoidant attachment as well, coming into play as well. And then if you layer in some of the other elements that manifest with ADHD, like forgetting commitments and so on, that in itself brings out shame, irrespective if there is an avoidant attachment or an insecure attachment style at play. But then couple that with the deep shame wounds that exist, it can significantly amplify the defensive reactions that happen if you call it out. And it doesn't have to be calling it out in a combative or confrontational way. Hey babe, like you forgot XYZ thing that we were going to do. That in itself, that's enough to trigger this tsunami of shame and their defensive reaction in response to that. So when we have the combination of executive dysfunction plus emotional detachment, it creates phenomenal levels of instability, and they can be completely unaware of what's happening, so they can't acknowledge it and they don't know what's going on. So the dysregulation and the shutdown is so phenomenally amplified. I've experienced it myself, but I've also been on the receiving end of it. And holy fuck, it's awful on both sides of the equation, but I don't know which one's worse. I think being on the receiving end of it is worse, especially if you have gone from being dysregulated to regulated. But that's just my bias because I'm speaking from my experience. Now, if you have ADHD and you don't have an avoidant attachment style, but your partner is avoidant, what can often happen is the ADHDer, and even outside of having ADHD, people do this anyway, but where it can amplify in the presence of ADHD is ADHDers can likely blame themselves for their partner's withdrawal. They can very often spiral into obsessive thinking and desperately try and reconnect with their partner that's withdrawn. And they may lean into many of the masking behaviors that they've just developed throughout their life, which is that people pleasing. So they might try and tone themselves down, become more amenable, to become easier, to become calmer, to become smaller. And this is where I call it shrinking pains as opposed to growing pains, because essentially we are causing ourselves a phenomenal amount of emotional distress from shrinking ourselves down to appease the emotional needs of someone else, which is something that we 100% shouldn't do, but that's a conversation for another day. Another thing that can happen is the ADHD, as well as people that don't have ADHD, but again, it can amplify, is the internalization of their silence being our failure for creating a successful relationship. And so what can happen is the ADHD can overfunction or overcompensate or overpursue when the other person has disengaged. And this is where it can really feed the development of a trauma bond, because when this happens, you're not chasing love, you're chasing regulation. You're trying to get them to soothe the nervous system dysregulation that they contributed to. So the neurocognitive elements of ADHD have loaded the gun, and then their behavior has pulled the trigger. And this is where it is so important, if you are aware of yourself having any of these elements at play, or you're experiencing something like this, to reach out to a healthy support network or a mental health professional for support. Because, and again, I'm not speaking at this from the perspective of a mental health professional. I am speaking at this from lived experience and working with mental health professionals. So none of this is mental health advice, but in my experience, when you have the combination of these events at play, this is when it can become a significant risk to not just someone's mental health, but to their life, because of how dysregulating and damaging it can be for that individual. And if there is not a support network around these people, it's a phenomenal risk and a significant concern. So any of the mental health services that exist, so some of the mental health hotlines, counsellors, online communities, if you are spiraling, please, for the love of God, do not internalize this. Don't feel shame around what you're experiencing, because there is a reason for it. It is valid, it is real, it is true, and there are people out there that want you here and want to help you. Now, I know that just got quite heavy, but it is real, it is a reality. So wrapping up, what this trifecta looks and feels like when it plays out. You meet someone, it's deep, it's intense, it's magnetic. They make you feel like this is it. You open up, you finally feel safe. But suddenly they withdraw, they go quiet. They're not as into it as they were a week ago, 6 hours ago, minutes ago. You panic, you may double down, and oftentimes this is the sunk cost fallacy. We can overcompensate for our partner's emotional withdrawal, and we may self-abandon in the hope of trying to get this person to stay in the relationship. So this is that shrinking pain I was talking about, which I will expand on again in other episodes. But oftentimes it will land at the person overthinking every word, every text, every silence. You feel like you're losing oxygen. Your brain can often be screaming, you've got to fix it, you've got to fix it, you've got to fix it. Your ADHD can make you obsessive. Your attachment wound can also make you obsessive. Your attachment wound makes you terrified. It triggers fear. Your body, it's now in survival mode. You confuse panic for love. You confuse longing for safety. But what you're really doing is trying to complete a trauma loop. Now, what are some signs that you might be caught in this little trifecta shit cake I'm talking about? You feel addicted to them, not connected. You idealize them while minimizing the pain that they've caused you. You lose your identity in trying to preserve the relationship. You can sometimes even just rewrite history to justify their emotional unavailability. You can feel emotionally wrecked when they pull away, yet you still defend them. And as soon as they come back and give you some love and attention, it's almost like the emotional neglect never happened. The high has outweighed the low. Now, what can you do instead? Slow down. If it's real, it doesn't need urgency. Speed is a nervous system red flag. Name your patterns. Are you hyper-focused on potential? Are you in love, or are you dysregulated, seeking regulation from an external source? Are you regulating your nervous system? You cannot choose what's good for you when you're in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. You very much need to grieve the fantasy. And this is where it's very hard and where people get very stuck. So you're grieving not just the person, but you're also grieving the story that you were writing about them, the future faking that you may have been part of. You can love who you thought they were, but you also need to recognize that both versions of them that you experienced are who they are. The one that brought love, attention, and seemed like the perfect person. No one's perfect. But then the person that invalidated you, that dismissed you, that discarded you, that is also who they are. And we need to reconcile this if we are to heal from it, grow from it, and let it go. And then this is very hard, but it takes time, but with healing you can get there, is rebuilding your identity, and rebuilding your identity outside of the relationship. You don't need someone to mirror your worth back to you. And this can be very hard and take a very long time for us to understand this, realize it, and put it into action. Now, in wrapping up, if you've lived this trifecta, firstly, I am sorry, but you are not alone. Please hear me as well. You're not too much, you're not broken, you're not doomed. You're just wired for intensity, you've adapted to survive, and you're learning how to live differently. Real love won't make you abandon yourself, but you need boundaries and self-awareness to do this as well. Real love won't confuse you, and it won't trigger your nervous system constantly to stay connected. And this is where the trifecta comes into play, because it can just set us up for gravitating towards unhealthy situations. What we need to really understand is real love is safe, it's steady, and it's clear, and you're not too much for needing it. Now, if you found this episode or any of the other content shared across the podcasts or the social media channels that I have, if you found it insightful, helpful, any of the above, I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe, share, comment, just help get the word out to try and share some collective healing love and help the channel grow. Now, we do have a number of episodes planned coming up. Some of them are going to be helping translate a little bit of the literature and research that exists out there in relation to relationship dynamics, attachment theory, female adult ADHD. So a little bit of a mixed bag if you are trying to understand things at a higher level. And again, I'm not a mental health professional, have worked in healthcare for years. I do dabble in research. So it is a niche area of interest of mine. So if I can help you understand a little bit of the evidence and research that exists out there, I would love to do so. But then there's also going to be a few episodes that are upcoming that are some shared and lived experiences, looking at things through the breakup lens and also through the lens of attachment healing and attachment trauma. So again, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I hope you feel seen, I hope you feel heard, and I hope you feel safe, and I'll see you next time.